Welcome! Our bakery uses only the finest ingredients. Upper crust goods for not much dough.
Talented and highly enthusiastic, it seems.
He's kneading the dough pretty hard, isn't he?
I would rather liken the motion to pounding myself.
I am quick to tell people all about my slightly unhealthy obsession with the Ace Attorney franchise. I have played every game in the series, watched the live-action movie, collected a fair deal of the manga. It's safe to say that I am a huge fan. My experiences with Professor Layton, however, are not quite as extensive. I did play the first title, Professor Layton and the Curious Village, but at the time I did not find myself enjoying it very much. With that said, Professor Layton vs. Phoenix Wright, Ace Attorney has still been one of my most highly anticipated 3DS titles in the history of the system. Although it came out in Japan back in 2012, it didn't reach the rest of the world until this year, and even then there was a 5-month gap between its release in Europe and Australia and its release in North America. Now that the game is playable worldwide, however, is it worth the wait? Well, a lot of that depends on your personal preferences. In this case, you'd have to be okay with a game that has you reading text for about 80% of its playtime. Both the Ace Attorney series and the Professor Layton series are known for being very story-heavy, text-filled games, involving a lot of reading, thinking, and not much else. If you're the type who doesn't care for story in video games, then this is a title that you can skip without much thought. So, how exactly do the two title characters meet? It begins when a young woman named Espella meets with Professor Layton and his assistant, Luke, in their London office. Espella tells them of the troubles in her hometown of Labyrinthia, piquing the professor's curiosity. Meanwhile, Phoenix Wright and his assistant, Maya, are visiting London for work when the two are pulled into the case after a series of circumstances. Eventually, both groups wind up in Labyrinthia, where not only do they have to discover its secrets, but defend the wrongly accused of being witches in the aptly named Witches' Court. As you would expect, the plot contains many twists and turns, but it always managed to keep me interested and on my toes throughout the majority of my playthrough. There were some places where the story became a bit dull, almost to the point of feeling somewhat like filler, specifically during one section in the middle of the game. Even then, however, it didn't hamper my experience enough to ruin my enjoyment of the game's story. The writing manages to fit the story's mood at various points rather well, knowing exactly when to be serious, when to crack a joke, or even be a little bit sad. I always love when a game can make me laugh, and Layton vs. Ace Attorney actually had me laughing out loud on a handful of occasions. My only real gripe with the storytelling as a whole is that many of the original characters come across as a bit bland. The main culprit of this is Espella, who I found to be dreadfully boring. She wasn't insufferable in any way, but it bothered me that such a plot-important character seemed to have very little character traits other than being nice. Many of the minor townspeople tend to be very one-dimensional as well, and there are a few that tended to grate on my nerves after a while. That's not to say that every character is like this, since I enjoyed the game's antagonist quite a bit, and Zacharias Barnum, the prosecutor in the witch trials, stuck in my mind as being a very engaging and well-rounded member of the cast. What will color your judgment, see what I did there, of this game more than anything else is your experience with past titles in either franchise. As I mentioned before, I'm a huge fan of the Ace Attorney series, but my experience with the Professor Layton titles is limited to the first game, which just didn't impress me. In the case of this crossover, the time spent in each character's gameplay style is split pretty evenly. For those like me who prefer one style to the other, that could feel a little disappointing. But the Layton gameplay portions did win me over as I made my way through the story. Exploring the world is done just like in the Professor Layton series, talking to people, solving the puzzles you find along the way, and looking around for hint coins to help you with the puzzles. And it makes sense since puzzles are quite literally the most iconic things about a Professor Layton game. And this one's no different as the title is chock full of them. Quite a few need to be solved in order to progress with the game's story, but there's a fair number that are found by poking around the game's many areas. To my surprise, most of the puzzles were rather fun to solve, mostly involving logical thinking. There were a handful that could be solved either through random guessing or pure trial and error, but more often than not I was able to think my way through a puzzle naturally. I only had to resort to the old trick of using all of your hint coins and then resetting the system in order to beat the puzzle on your first try a handful of times throughout my playthrough of the game. One complaint I do have, however, is that a lot of the puzzles tended to repeat the same scenarios a handful of times. And even among the different types of puzzles, a lot of them boil down to get thing A from place B to place C. This isn't a huge complaint, but it did make a handful of the puzzles feel a bit tedious. The other half of the game is spent in the courtroom, where you cross-examine witnesses and present evidence just like in the Ace Attorney series. The main twist put on this formula is that most of the time you will be cross-examining multiple witnesses at once, and occasionally you'll have to switch witnesses during the middle of a specific question in order to find the right information to proceed. This mechanic is interesting on paper, but in practice it mostly just adds another thing to check in every single round of cross-examination. A smaller added element is that Layton's hint coins can be used to point players in the right directions during these sequences. Everything else works just as well as it does in the other Ace Attorney games, however, and it's interesting to have a trial where your logic is dictated by things like witchcraft and magic, instead of the normally scientific-minded approach present in the main series. Thankfully, both series mechanics managed to fit together remarkably well. As an Ace Attorney fan, the Professor Layton segments did not feel out of place at all, simply feeling like a more puzzle-heavy variation on the more mundane investigations of the Ace Attorney universe. Artistically, I love this game's graphics. Somehow, despite Professor Layton and Ace Attorney having drastically different art styles, Capcom in Level 5 managed to create a world that fits both series like a glove. The designs for the new characters are striking and memorable, and the background art in particular is stunning at points. It's only when you look at the game from a technical standpoint that a few cracks begin to show. There's some occasional minor clipping in the character models, and while the animation is fluid, there are points where the game's frame rate takes a pretty drastic hit. Turning on the game's 3D effect makes certain graphical oddities a bit more noticeable, particularly the mix of 2D assets in a 3D space. The game's gorgeous animated cutscenes also look odd in 3D, since leaving the effect on can result in things like houses floating above the dirt directly underneath them. If you want the best visual experience you can with Professor Layton vs. Phoenix Wright, you should probably turn the 3D off. Musically, I found the game to be adequate. While the tracks did fit the mood quite well, very few of them managed to be particularly memorable, although the questioning theme for the witch trial is one that tends to stick in my head. The voice acting fares much better than the music, however, since every actor goes all out and delivers a performance that matches the character they are portraying. The acting does get a bit hammy at points, but for a game like this, it's appropriate for the most part. I just wish there was more of it, since the voice acting is reserved only for the most important moments in the game. Despite a few clunky bits here and there, Professor Layton vs. Phoenix Wright Ace Attorney is a game that I enjoyed playing front to back. I liked the game quite a lot, and even though I'm far more of an Ace Attorney fan than a Professor Layton fan, I found myself having just as much fun solving puzzles on the field as I did pointing out contradictions in the courtroom. Although I wouldn't suggest the game as an introduction to either series, if you're familiar with one or the other, I highly recommend giving it a shot. Hi, I'm Ted, or Axe and Shadow from Brain Scratch Comms, and I hope you enjoyed the review. If you'd like to hear me talk a bit more about Ace Attorney, there's a link you can follow to the Brain Scratch Comms retrospective on the Ace Attorney series. Thanks for watching, and be sure to stay tuned to GameXplain for more on Professor Layton, Ace Attorney, and other things gaming too. Thanks, guys.